Chiawen Chiang is a research associate at the Welfare Footprint Institute and a researcher at New York University's WATR-lab, where she studies fish behavior and welfare. Her current work focuses on species-specific welfare impacts in aquaculture and the behavioral complexity of fish in both captive and wild environments.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Chow. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I want to talk about a underappreciated phenomenon of aquaculture today. So 95% of individuals in terrestrial agriculture span just 6 species. If we compare that to how that looks in aquaculture, or the farming of aquatic animals and aquatic systems, that number is actually 35 species as of 2021. And I started my research basically wanting to understand how welfare risks are distributed across this diversity. And so the initial question was to answer that, but over the process of my work, I was alerted to something that might actually be a much larger problem. So the initial project was focused on trying to understand how these welfare risks are distributed across the diversity. And essentially, it was based on the premise that species with much more complex needs, like carnivory, having highly migratory lives, or otherwise requiring a lot of complexity, and are inherently much more difficult to farm properly in industrial commercial systems. So they're much more difficult to take care of in captivity. So if we imagine trying to care for a tuna versus a mussel in a traditional farm that are generally very sedentary and are filter feeders, we immediately see how welfare risks can accrue in species that have much more complex lives. And what I found when I mapped these welfare risks to global production data, I found that species most associated with high welfare risks are also a cost more to produce per ton, and yet contribute less to global production. And so that actually contradicts a lot of this discourse around the food security space, that animal welfare needs are much too difficult, too expensive to produce at scale for it to be associated with actually producing food for people in a very cost-effective way. And so my work kind of showed that that was actually the opposite. But that's not really what I want to talk about here today. What I want to talk about really is the explosion in diversity. So in 2015, the 95% of individuals in aquaculture was just 12 species. And in 6 years, that more than doubled to 35. And so what I became concerned about is that, does diversity per se undermine our ability to help aquatic animals? And so let's work through the logic here together. Some basic information. Fishes are roughly actually about the same number of diversity as mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians combined. So they are actually an extremely diverse group that we just don't really appreciate because we're terrestrial animals and we don't spend time underwater. And we are also very, very clueless about most of them. 64% of individuals in aquaculture have no welfare literature about their species. And so for me, as a welfare researcher, I'm thinking about I spend most of my time thinking about their biology, what it means to develop good welfare indicators for them. How do we actually implement that on the ground in a way that's feasible, in a way that doesn't reach or cause any backfiring effects? And that's not really the case, though, for most animal welfare advocates. We are mostly familiar with how easily it is to scale, for example, cage-free commitments, and it gets really, really cost-effective at that point. But that actually obscures that most of the work happens here when we're developing species-level biology or understanding that developing welfare indicators that takes decades. And so I wanted to understand, basically, my current project is trying to understand to what extent diversification is going to be a risk for our ability to do good work cost effectively for animals. So let's imagine a world with 100 billion farmed animals. Let's say we have about 500 million of a total advocacy budget. And maybe it costs $5 million per species to do research, to understand their biology, develop welfare indicators, and so on, get public stakeholder buy-in, et cetera, public awareness campaigns. And it costs $0.005 per animal to implement at scale, roughly 200 million animals helped for $1. Thank you to ChatGPT for helping me make these equations. So in a 5-species world, we could expect to cover 95% of individuals through our efforts. And compare that to a 50-species world, we can only cover about 50% of them through our advocacy efforts. So currently, I'm trying to work on a project that tries to understand what are the expected welfare burdens under high, medium, and low diversification scenarios. I am a welfare person, and I would love to talk to people who are really good at math, economics, and predicting futures. So talk to me if you want to work together on this project. Thank you.